Hello everyone. Welcome to our channel of confession and cheating stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the bell notification to increase engagement. Before we get to our video, let's move on to our video. Greetings, comrades. My name is Mao. I'm 30 years old, and I'm going to share with you a story I never imagined I would live. You know, I'm not the kind of woman who pulls aside every person on the street. Despite my modesty, I managed to attract attention wherever I went, maybe because I was tall, dark, well-groomed. And of course, the watermelon in my hand. Is it impossible not to see it? Despite this appearance, I have always been cautious, especially in professional or academic settings. My roommates have even guessed that despite my good-natured exterior, I have a much more daring side. Even my closest friends are not fully aware of who I am. Even though they have known me for years, they have never seen the other side of me. You see, that's the way I like it. I like to protect this side of my personality from criticism. No one realizes that underneath my good girl persona, there is always a twisted and provocative side. I really love exploring emotions. I love getting butterflies in my stomach when I'm about to do something that seems unusual. Since I was very young, I have always been fascinated by the feeling of freedom and the experience of the unexpected. I am attracted to this adrenaline rush from stressful events. I realize it is almost an addiction. You are aware of my fascination with the fine line that separates right from wrong, right? But from the outside, nobody realizes that. For a long time I maintained this cool girl image because I was very good at hiding it, but I was constantly letting myself feel it inside. Letting myself be carried away by the feelings my body gave me. I believe it is a gift that we should cherish as long as we treat it with care and respect. The most interesting part of this story is that I have always had an attraction to older men. We have always taken a more responsible stance. I have always been fascinated by security. However, one day I realized that there was something really different that made me attractive to older men. I never imagined that this would result in feelings, not from just anyone, but from someone who had always been around me, like my cousin. It is indeed true. With him everything became stronger and stronger, and I was always drawn to the forbidden. Actually, the story starts here. For as long as I can remember, I've always been attracted to older men. When I was young, I remember thinking that men my age were a bit boring and stupid. While my friends were grumbling about boys at school, I was already noticing the grey-haired, straight-backed young men with trainers who worked nearby. This sense of security has always felt more connected to life. The experienced coping strategy has always appealed to me. I didn't mind dating someone my own age, but it felt like something was missing. I felt the same with older men. There was more than just looks. Of course, I've always been attracted to older men, but what really attracted me was the sense that they had a wealth of life experience and stories to tell. I found this fascinating. While women my age were busy going to clubs and parties, I dreamed of having in-depth discussions and sharing ideas with someone more experienced than myself. I always found this kind of connection much more engaging. Over time, I began to see that my choice was bigger than I initially believed. It was more than a phase. She never seemed to have the maturity of a man who knew what he wanted out of life. At least, when dating someone my age, I wasn't going to give up. The strange thing was that even though I kept my good girl persona, deep down I felt different, as if I had two personalities and lived in two different universes. On the one hand, Mao was shy. On the other hand, he was more passionate and longed for something illegal. My cousin came into the story at this point. For as long as I can remember, he has been the womanizer of the family. It was a common joke among my relatives that he had not been with the same woman 2 Christmases in a row. At the time, I was still seeing things from a distance. I didn't think much of it, but I found it amusing. But over time, things evolved. He started popping up on my radar in unexpected places. Although I had always liked older men, I began to feel differently about him. Because he was more than twice my age at the time, he was over 40, I was attracted to his demeanor and posture, which was befitting someone who had been through a lot. Everything about his appearance fascinated me. A distant admiration turned into something much stronger. He was my cousin. That was the problem. Although I had always let myself feel what my body was telling me, I knew that this time it was different. The fact that he was related to me was a bigger problem than the age difference, so everything became much more forbidden. I never thought he could make me feel anything other than a familial bond. He often cracked jokes at family gatherings and was the cool cousin. The elders cherished him, and he admitted he was a womanizer, but time began to change me in some way. By this point, he was well over 40, and I was in my early 20s. Surprisingly, I was drawn to his confident demeanor. At first, I thought it was just admiration. Everyone admired my cousin, but most of all, his mother, my aunt. She was the daughter who took care of the house, was always ready to help, and did everything for her family. I found her complicated life funny, but I wasn't immediately impressed. Over time, this interest turned into curiosity, and as my interest grew, it turned into an irresistible attraction. It was on one of these trips to his house that I began to realize what was really happening to me. It was where I used to go on vacation. I loved the quiet atmosphere, and they treated me as if I were a member of the household. Even though my cousin was not living with them at the time, he would often visit on weekends to spend time with his family. During one of these visits, I realized that I was observing him differently. His voice, his grin, his smell, everything was starting to affect me. I was drawn to my cousin, and that's when the money fell. At first I believed it was a temporary phase, one of those temporary obsessions that would eventually disappear. But, contrary to my expectations, everything became stronger. My heart was pounding every time he came. Only I knew that there was tension in the air with every conversation we had and every grin he gave me. The more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt in these conflicting emotions. I still pretended I was my good cousin, but there was a longing inside me that I couldn't suppress. At times, I even tried to convince myself that this was just a phase and that it would eventually pass. But the more I tried to forget, the more my thoughts about him grew. Even though I knew this, I couldn't stop myself. This is how my fantasies about him started. At different intervals during the day, I would sometimes find myself thinking about him. The more I tried to fight it, the stronger, more forbidden, and unattainable it became. This only made the situation worse. I knew then that I had to deal with this feeling somehow. But how? How could I inform him without creating a family scandal? Or worse, how could I deal with the thought that he might not share my feelings? Every day I was tortured by this question. My naive respect for my cousin eventually turned into a real infatuation. I realized that I was always thinking about her, or at least constructing scenarios that would never happen in real life. Every time I went to my aunt's house, my longing for her grew, and the more I was drawn to her, the harder it was to cope. She was my cousin, and the age difference made things even more difficult. So on the one hand, I knew it was bad, but the feeling of experiencing something forbidden excited and surprised me even more. Once I had a migraine while on vacation at my aunt's house, and she ordered me to rest in my cousin's room. The room had air conditioning, and she wasn't home to deal. When I lay down on his bed, it was as if all the fantasies I had ever had came true. Her scent was on the sheets. My thoughts raced as I tried to relax, imagining what it would be like to be with him, to walk into the room and see me lying in that position on his bed. I wondered what would happen if he noticed me lying there. Then, something unexpected happened. After I had been asleep for a few minutes, I heard someone enter the house. It was him, my cousin. When he entered the room, my heart started pounding. My face was on the pillow because I was sleeping on my stomach. I made an effort to look like I was asleep. I had no idea what to expect. One thing came to my mind. Would my presence make him uneasy? Would he feel something too? Or something worse? She couldn't hide her anxiety as she came to me and called me. In my heart, I wanted the moment to continue, but I told her that everything was fine and that I was leaving. At that point, I realized that I could no longer control my emotions. I began to see that my desire for her was a combination of sexual desire and fear of being found out. All this shook me in a way I had never felt before. No matter how much I tried to hide it, I knew it wouldn't go away so quickly. At that time, every time I saw her, inappropriate thoughts ran through my mind. I even fantasized about him. I imagined what it would be like for him to come to me on one of these visits and shatter all the boundaries set by morality and family. It was very difficult to deal with these feelings. Sometimes I felt guilty for having this thought, but I couldn't help desiring more. The daydreaming increased in intensity. One night, I fantasized about what it would be like if he walked into the room I was in while everyone was asleep and pulled me towards him, just the two of us. This anxiety would silently overtake me. Worst of all, these fantasies kept me awake at night. I thought of scenarios that I knew were unlikely to come true. Would it ever happen? A doubt crept in. I had no one to discuss these ideas with, and these were my constant companions. I couldn't even tell my family, let alone my friends. I had no choice but to live with this internal struggle every day, in the hope that an answer would eventually come. My feelings were fleeting. I wanted to know if it was a desire or something deeper, but every time I went to my aunt's house, it became harder and harder to keep everything under control. I knew I was risking my life. I knew there would be terrible consequences if things got out of control. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't stop the urges of my body and mind. I felt that I was being guided by something more powerful, that I was getting closer and closer to my goals. Of course, this couldn't be a secret. After all, we were constantly surrounded by our relatives. Any more exposure would have been devastating. Every time I went to my aunt's, I dressed a little more elegantly, in a way that impressed without being overdressed, but it was clear that I felt good when she was around. I made an effort to get closer to her, her jokes from time to time. A simple pat on the arm would elicit a longer giggle. Little things that didn't seem important to others had a deeper significance for me. At one point, I wanted to check if he had noticed the tension between us. I had to be discreet, but I also wanted to see if he would notice. I couldn't go too far. I didn't want to put us both in an awkward situation, as my cousin had always been extremely respectful towards me. Although he was known as a womanizer, He always treated his family seriously. He always had a good relationship with his family, and I never saw him bring a girlfriend to my uncle's house. I was aware that anything that happened could affect his bond with them, and I didn't want to cross that line without confirming that he was ready to do it. One day, I decided to visit my aunt's house, and although I was tired and sweaty, I knew that my cousin would most likely be there. I put on my form-fitting sportswear that showed off my body and set off. When I got there, I was disappointed to find that she wasn't home. Still, I continued talking to my aunt as usual. Even though I was looking forward to her coming, I always did this to make it seem as if I was there just to see her. And then she was there. My heart was pounding as usual. He greeted me with a grin and entered the room. Now was the ideal moment to see how far I could push myself. I was fully committed to provoking him to gauge his reaction. Finally, I went to his room under the guise of asking for a loan. After knocking on the door, I walked in, distracted by something on his cell phone. I tried not to show how annoyed I was. I noticed he was a bit agitated as we chatted about trivial matters. Did he understand what I was trying to say? Was someone provoking you? Was I out of my depth? I made an effort to watch his every move and look. Then, in mid-sentence, I burst out laughing and touched his arm lightly, which was enough to change the atmosphere. He averted his eyes for a while, but then grinned. He looked nervous. At that moment, I realized that he was beginning to understand what I was doing. Or, at least, he shared my feeling of nervousness. I wasn't sure how far I could push myself, but the seduction game had worked. I knew I couldn't force things. I knew that no matter how fierce the need inside me was, everything had to be delicate and discreet. I didn't want to scare him. I didn't even want to put anything in our way. I didn't want to let the conversation end abruptly, so I left the room carefully. My pulse quickened as I walked away. Something was finally happening, but I still had no idea what he was thinking. Now that the game was over, I had to wait for the next move. The intensity of this game of seduction was increasing, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was about to happen. Every time we saw each other, the tension increased. I was making an effort to stay calm and act normal, but I felt like a volcano was about to erupt inside me. I felt like something was going to happen sooner or later. I honestly couldn't wait any longer. It was hard to feel it, to want to finally know how he felt about all this. One Friday night, things started to change dramatically. I had intended to spend the night at my aunt's, so I went there as usual after a long day. She always liked to see me there, even if she wasn't home at the beginning of the night. I knew she would be back later. This time I was determined to push the limits to the limit. After dinner, my aunt went upstairs to sleep while I stayed in the living room to read and drink coffee. She always went to bed early, leaving me to wait for my cousin in the quiet of the house. When he got there, I was lying on my side in a position that would undoubtedly attract his attention, as the sofa in the living room was directly in front of the front entrance. It was certainly no coincidence that I found myself in this predicament. I was laying the foundation. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the click of the keys. My head started to spin, and so did my heart. It had finally arrived. I was lying on my side with an open book in my hand, as if I had accidentally fallen asleep on the couch. Everything was lit by the soft light of the room, which gave the place an almost personal feel. When he came in, I could feel the intense silence. He closed the door and remained motionless for a few minutes, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. After a long time, he walked over to the sofa. I could feel his warmth next to me. Then He put my hair behind my ear and moved it away from my face. He touched me lightly and said in a husky voice that always made me shiver, "Cousin, your back will ache when you sleep there." But it was enough to release all the emotions I had been suppressing. My body reacted immediately, causing my fever, which I had kept under control for so long, to suddenly flare up. I stiffened a little, as if I was just getting dressed, pretended to wake up, and tried to mask my uneasiness. But in reality, I knew it was time to test whether the game I had been playing for so long would work. He looked at me with a strange grin, as if he wasn't sure what to do. "It would be more comfortable to sleep in bed," he said, pointing to his room. At this point, I realized that he was reluctantly joining the game, so I told him that everything was fine, as if everything was normal, and went to his room. When I entered his room, he was in a very different mood. The air conditioning kept the air cool, but I couldn't control how hot I felt inside. My whole body was tense with anticipation, even though it looked like I was about to get some sleep. I heard the sound of the water as he showered, and my mind was racing with all the ideas that were popping up. I knew it was now or never. I knew. The smell of soap and cologne filled the room as I stepped out of the shower, rejuvenated. My body reacted immediately, as if it was still trying to retain control. When he asked if I needed a blanket or something thinner, the situation was out of control. I was aware of his distance. I wanted to see how far he would go, but I also wanted him to know that I was ready to overcome myself. "If he wasn't going to sleep here," I asked. When he finally fell asleep next to me, exhausted, I realized that our relationship would never be the same. Everything changed after that night. Time seemed to freeze during the hours we spent together. I had never experienced such an adrenaline rush in my body. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the moment we were in. In the dark room, there was a feeling of freedom and danger, like the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the touch of our bodies against each other. Every second that passed, we were getting further and further away from reality. When it was all over, did that make it all better? He lay down next to me, exhausted. Even though the room was freezing, I could feel the warmth of his body through his frantic breathing. But I was in ecstasy. I had mixed feelings of guilt, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was lost in my thoughts. What had we done? How was he going to change the situation? Was this a sign of his weakness? Or did he share my feelings? I knew he wouldn't tell anyone. My cousin was always extremely careful. He would never jeopardize his reputation, especially where his family was concerned. But that didn't take away my fear. What was going through his mind? Even worse, what if someone had heard? When he finally seemed to be falling asleep, my worries began to creep in, and I found it hard to relax. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was an almost frightening silence in the house. My pulse quickened at every sound, no matter how small. I stood up carefully and made my way to the guest room, trying not to make any noise. I couldn't spend the whole night there. Even if no one saw me, he and I couldn't share the same bed. I needed time to sort through my thoughts and try to understand what was going on inside me. I lay on the bed in the guest room, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, replaying every moment of that night in my mind. When I remembered the next morning, light shone through the windows. The house was quiet, and it was late. My aunt was preparing lunch when I walked into the kitchen, still trying to look as organized as possible. No doubt something unexpected had happened the night before, as she greeted me with her usual grin. She stirred the pots and greeted me with a grin. My cousin left early to go surfing with his friends. I was instantly relieved that he was gone, and I wouldn't have to deal with him again. For the rest of the morning, I tried to pretend nothing was wrong. My aunt was chatting about trivial matters as usual. I tried to focus, but my thoughts were scattered and still focused on what had happened the night before. Although it was a powerful experience, I felt empty and guilty afterwards. Had I gone too far? Was there anything I regretted? Did I realize I couldn't go back? I knew that nothing would ever be the same between us after that night. But what was done was done. We were more than relatives. We had a bond that I couldn't quite understand. However, there was a burden that came with that relationship, and I wasn't sure I was ready to carry it. For several weeks, I avoided visiting my aunt's house. Not only did I not know how I would react when I saw my cousin again, I didn't want her to notice that something was wrong with me. I wasn't sure if it was something that didn't need to be dwelled on, if she was avoiding me too, or if it was just an experience for her. My mind was still full of questions. Maybe deep down I knew this story wasn't over yet, but for now I needed to take a deep breath and deal with what had happened. It took a while to sink in. After that night, the depth of my feelings for my cousin began to change. In the beginning, happiness and regret were still mixed together. But as the days passed, my feelings became more complex. I began to reflect on what had happened and wonder if this was the life I really wanted. It was at least a little liberating, but it also raised a number of questions I hadn't expected. In the days that followed, I made a point of avoiding my cousin. To be honest, I had no idea what he was thinking or what I wanted him to think. If this was just another relationship for him, would I accept it? And if he did accept it, if he expected more from the interaction, would I be prepared to deal with it? I went through a lot of mental anguish. Despite my best efforts to move on, the memories of that night continued to consume me. I always felt uneasy whenever I passed by my aunt's house, but at the same time I was afraid of the truth. What if she felt bad about it? What if she made a mistake? After a few weeks, I started to feel more comfortable. I realized that although the experience was great, I couldn't define who I was or what I wanted out of life. It was definitely a great experience, but it was short-lived. Not because I no longer thought about my cousin, but rather because the fantasies that used to occupy most of my thoughts began to fade. I realized that my immense longing for him was gradually diminishing. I wasn't as obsessive as I used to be, and he seemed to have stopped enjoying the experience. We texted less and less. Maybe he was trying to make sense of it all. Maybe he realized, like me, that even though what we had was special, we had to move on. No arguments or unspoken words were heard. The separation seemed natural, as if she was letting our relationship go back to the way it was, or at least letting our interactions become uncomfortable. I couldn't help but note that my aunt sometimes mentioned me and told me how thoughtful I was for going with her, even though I still remember going to see them. Even though we hadn't spoken, I was aware that she was aware of me, and I was somewhat relieved that she continued to be aware of me even though I was far away. The last time we met, there was a strange silence. The mood between my aunt and me, based on my visits, was light, as if nothing had happened. We both smiled as we greeted each other and realized that that chapter in our history had spontaneously ended, without reason or regret. After all, the incident between my cousin and me was extremely intense and noteworthy, Besides, it was no longer an issue. I don't believe I need to relive that moment, but I don't regret that I did. All that remains is the memory of the adrenaline rush I had that evening, and maybe a bit of nostalgia. But I knew it was time to move on, because everything in life passes, so gradually everything went back to normal. My cousin became a memory that I sometimes recall with pleasure, but a memory that no longer really exists. And what about me? Now that I felt more free, I continued to explore my brave side. Even though my dreams and desires are part of my identity, I realize that I am responsible for them. This is the end of our story of deception. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the bell notification to be notified of our stories before anyone else. See you in our next cheating story. Goodbye.